Hello and welcome to the OTB channel. Today I'm going to look at something that is very different from the norm. It's called nixos, and yes, it's a Linux distro that's really there to showcase a new form of package management that I haven't seen before, and I'll say from the outset, I'm pretty impressed. See you after the intro. Okay, welcome back. So it's been a few months now that since I became aware of nixos, and I have watched a few videos, review videos along the way, and initially I thought, that looks a little bit like it could be too hard to do. But I kept getting requests. You should look at nixos. You should look at nixos. So this week I've spent a little bit of time looking at it, and I've come away thinking, wow, that is such an interesting idea. So many distros out there just follow exactly the same path. Yes, we have a different package manager and different themes, but for the most part, apart from the availability of particular packages, they're much the same. And it's why I decided some time ago to stop distro hopping as such and to stay with Arch and Debian. And there aren't many distros that I've looked at that at the end of it I've gone, wow, that's really something. And I have to say with this one, that's the feeling I got. It's not perfect. You can't install it through a nice graphical next process. You have to get down and dirty, and you have to create a configuration file. But that in itself isn't really hard. And the build process, what's interesting about the build process is you create a configuration file, you build it, and then as you change your configuration file and add new packages and new settings, each build is separate to all the others. So it's almost like it's sandboxed, and previous builds cannot interfere with new builds. Really interesting for a couple of reasons. One, if you make a complete mess of your configuration, it's really easy to roll back to when it was working previously. And it's the same with the packages. It is possible to install multiple versions of the same package because they're all sandboxed. Now, what this means is it departs from the standard Linux way of doing things and the standard way of putting packages and binaries in certain files and folders. And I'll be honest, I'm still getting used to that. But from what I can see, I can really see how this could be useful. So you could have one configuration file that I could, for instance, save on my GitLab, just like my dot files, and I can reproduce my build of nixos wherever. That's got to be worth something. Let's go over to the nixos website and take a look. So here we are at the nixos website. At its heart, Nix is a package manager. You don't have to install it as a whole distro. I believe you can install it on any distro that you want and benefit from many of its features. But they do a distro as well, which is a way, I suppose, of showcasing the Nix package manager. And as you can see here, it's reproducible builds and deployment is what it's all about. So reproducible because packages are built in isolation from each other, and so it prevents all sorts of dependency problems. And if a package works on one machine, it's going to work on another. It's declarative. That's a bit of a word to get your tongue round, but that's all about this configuration file, how it's easy to share, how it's easy to swap between different environments. If you have your declarative configuration file, it makes life easy. And it's reliable. You can't break other packages by installing an additional package. Because they're all sandboxed, they all kind of work as their own thing. I'm not describing this in technical terms, but it's robust. It's really robust. And the good thing is there's over 60,000 packages in the Nix package repository, which is great. So how do we go about getting this? Well, they do have some downloads here. And when you go to the download page, the first one is just about Nix, the package manager, and how you can install it on any distro, really. But what you probably want to look for is NixOS 2009, the graphical ISO images. Now, they do a couple of graphical ISO images. They do a GNOME version and they do a Plasma version. They also do a minimal ISO, which has no graphical environments. Now, the graphical environments I'm going to use for this video. But to be honest, because you're going to build everything on the command line anyway, all it is really is a delivery system for you to do so. The graphical environment also allows you to bring up the NixOS manual, so in a web browser, so you can kind of follow along in the terminal all the various instructions for building and installing your system. I do have a criticism, though. I downloaded initially the Plasma ISO, and in VirtualBox I had dreadful problems. It defaulted at 800 by 600, the resolution, and I could only get the graphical environment to come up when I used the standard VB SVGA setting. Otherwise, you'd just get the command line. I could see on Xrandr that there were other resolutions available, including 1680 by 1050. It doesn't have the VirtualBox guest editions included, so I was never going to get full HD, but that wasn't a big issue. But the thing was, as I tried to set the resolution in the Plasma variant, it would set it for a split second and then it would immediately jump back to 800 by 600. And so it was essentially unusable. So I ended up downloading GNOME and doing it through that. I think this is an issue because if people are going to have a play with something so different, the chances are, like me, you're going to install it on VirtualBox and you're going to have a play. In the end, on the many hours that I've spent just fiddling about with this, I've tended to go for the minimal ISO image and just build everything from there, because why bother with a graphical environment? But for the sake of this, I'm going to show you that. They do a VirtualBox image, which does have the guest editions included, but that's a pre-built system. And if you want to play about with installing and configuring the system, you're probably not going to want to go for that. You're going to want to go for the standard ISO image. So that's what I've done. But I do think they need to get the graphical ISO images correct. It would be nice to have VirtualBox guest editions in, and they really need to sort out this Plasma one. That's my one big criticism of this. Other than that, it's pretty positive. What I really like is the fact that they have a manual, and they have a great manual that takes you through just about everything you could possibly need. And on the desktops that you install, it has a version of this or a link to it as well. And if you click on installing Nix, it literally tells you, what you need to do, partitioning, whether you're going to use UEFI, MBR, formatting, installing, configuring, etc., etc. And you could follow along and literally just copy and paste commands from this and have it alongside. And that's what I did to start off with. I think good documentation is the key to something like this when it's so new. And NixOS seems to have got that right. So let me take you through what is a rather basic demonstration. I'm going to boot the GNOME or the GNOME ISO. I'm going to do an installation. I'm going to install XFCE to start with. I'm going to add Mate. I'm also going to add Qtile. I'll briefly be looking at how you get rid of all the iterations to save a bit of space once you're happy with your setup. And I'm also going to look at how you can install packages on the command line. So without further ado, let's go. Right, so what you should see in front of you is the NixOS live CD, the GNOME live CD. It doesn't appear to have the VirtualBox guest editions installed, so I've had to settle on 1680 by 1050. However, you know, we're not going to be in this very much. It's almost irrelevant whether you use the GNOME ISO or the Plasma ISO. The bottom line is this is simply a vehicle to get the installation done. And you can pick whatever desktop environment or window manager you want after that. So what I've done so far is I've just opened up GNOME Terminal and I've opened up Firefox at the NixOS manual. And the simplest way to do this is to go to installing NixOS in the manual, decide what you're going to do in terms of UEFI or standard BIOS install. And if you're using VirtualBox to play with this, you know your disk's going to be called SDA. And the manual suggests you use parted. And you can just copy and paste these commands directly into the terminal. As well as formatting. For some reason, they say when you format it, you should attach a label to the partition. I'm not quite sure why we use a label, why dev SDA or SDA1 wouldn't be enough, but nevertheless, as it's suggesting a label, we'll do it. I'm sure you could use UUID as well. And then we simply install and we follow along. Now, I've done this a few times, so I'm not going to do a straightforward copy and paste. I'm just going to shut down the Firefox web browser here, and I'm going to see if I can make GNOME Terminal full screen and perhaps just increase. Okay, I was going to say perhaps just increase the font a little bit. That's a strange sort of effect, but you get the idea. Now, I'm not going to use parted. I'm comfortable with using CF disk for my partitioning, and that's actually included on this system. You could equally use gparted, so whatever you want. The most important thing, though, is you have to be root, and at the moment, we have no passwords. However, if I just do sudo su, it will switch me to the root user, so all good. And then I'm just going to launch CF disk. For the sake of this, I'm just going to stick with a standard BIOS mode installation. So I want a DOS partition table. I'm going to create a new partition. I'm not going to bother with swap or anything like that. I've created a 32 gig virtual hard drive. I'm going to use all of that space. We'll let it be a primary partition. I'll set the type to Linux, and I'll also need to set that to bootable. Okay, all good. So we just need now to write that and actually type yes, not just W. Okay, so we're all done. So let's quit out of CF disk. Now, the next thing is we've created the partition, but we obviously have to format it. I am going to create an ext4 partition, which is pretty straightforward. So mkfs.ext4, and it suggests we create a label. So you just use the -L there, and we'll just call it NixOS. Oops, if I can type properly. And we know that's going to be dev SDA1. Obviously, if you're installing this on real hardware, that name might well change, but you get the idea. So let's just format that. So all done. We now have to mount that partition, and we're going to mount it on /MNT. So we're already the root user, so that's good. And we're going to mount dev disk. See if that. Yeah. Okay. Dev disk by label. And we called it nixos. And we're going to mount that on MNT. So let me just check that I've got that right. Mount dev disk by label nixos on mount. All good. Last but not least, before we get into tinkering with the system, we need to generate a config file. And we do this by typing nixos dash, and if you hit the tab key, you'll see that there's a few options there. We want the generate config, and we have to add the option here, root /mount, so it knows where it's going to put the config file, and hit enter. All good. So we now have a configuration file that we can go in and we can edit. And it suggests we use nano to do this. So I'm going to use nano. Don't forget you're mounted on MNT, but the config file itself is in etc nixos. I'm just having a look. And it's called configuration.nix. There you are. So nano mount etc nixos configuration.nix. And you open it up. And initially when I looked at this, I thought, that could be quite problematic if I wasn't overly sure what I needed to mount. I'm just looking at the green here. It's a little bit in your face, but at least hopefully you can see it. But actually, most of the options you need are here already. A lot of the options are commented out, but you don't have to actually uncomment that much. So if you move down here, use the grub 2 bootloader. Well, if you look at the first few options after the ones that are uncommented, enable grub, use grub 2, the rest are about EFI support or UEFI support. Well, I've just done a standard BIOS install, so I don't need to worry about that. However, I do need to tell it where to install grub. And I want to install it on dev SDA, so I'm just going to uncomment that. We'll line it up a little bit like that. We then move down. Networking host name. Do we want to set a host name? Sure, let's stick with the default there, which is nixos. All good. Wireless, do we need to enable wireless? No, I don't think so. But the next section, set your time zone. At the moment, well, it says Amsterdam, Europe, Amsterdam. That clearly isn't me. So we've uncommented it, and I'm going to set it to London. Carry on moving down. There's some stuff there about DHCP. It looks like it's picked up my network interface, EMP0S3, which it will have done when we've generated the config file, so we'll just leave that as normal. Network proxy, we don't need to do anything about that. We then come to the internationalization section. So we do need, or it would be useful to set this correctly. So I'm just going to uncomment these. And what do we need to do? So it's currently set to US, and I'm going to set it to GB. And rather than a US key map, we're going to set it to a UK key map. Let me just check that everything looks right. Don't, by the way, forget to uncomment this closing bracket. I've done that a few times and couldn't figure out why it wouldn't build. Right. enable the GNOME 3 desktop. We'll come to that in a minute. Let's move beyond that. Configure the key map in X11. Yeah, sure, why not? Now, confusingly, if you're in the UK, you would think that you would just set this to UK as well. But actually, in X11, you use GB. So you have UK for the I18N definition, and you have GB for the X11 key map. Do we want cups turned on? No, I don't think we do. Do we want pulse audio and sound turned on? No. Do we want to enable our touchpad support? Well, no, we don't, but that would be useful clearly if we had a laptop here, and then we get the opportunity here to define a normal user. So let's just uncomment this bit. Don't forget the closing bracket here. And all I'm going to change here is where it says Jane. My name clearly isn't Jane. Could be, but it's not. I'm just going to set that as OTB. It's already in the wheel group, so we can use sudo. We then get down to this section, list packages installed in the system profile. So, okay, we're going to uncomment the line which says environment.system packages. And we're going to uncomment everything else down to the closing bracket. And here you get the option to add whatever you want, basically. So let's just make this a little bit neater. So wget vim firefox. Let's add alacrity to it. Do we need anything else at this stage? Let's try Chromium as well. Okay, I would probably, if I was going to use this all the time, neaten this up and list these things in sections, you know, web applications, terminal applications, etc., etc. We then get to a section about some programs needing SUID wrappers. We don't need that. Services we want to enable. We could enable SSH here, but we're not going to bother. We're not going to do anything with the firewall. And this is pretty much the end of the file, and it already says we're on version 20.09. So we just have one thing to do really now. I want to go back to the section that talks about installing the GNOME 3 desktop. I don't want to do this, guys. You won't be surprised to know. So what am I going to change here? Well, I'm just going to delete GNOME 3 there and leave it as enable the desktop environment. Services.x server enable. Yes, we do want to enable the X server, that's for sure. Services X server display manager GDM enable. I don't want to use GDM. I would prefer to use LightDM. So I'm just going to replace GDM with LightDM. And services.xserver.desktop manager. Do I want GNOME 3? No, I don't. I want XFCE. So I'm just going to replace GNOME 3 with XFCE there. Do I need anything else at this stage? No, I think we're pretty much there. So I'm going to save this file and exit it. And let's just give ourselves a clean terminal. What we have to do now is we have to essentially just build the system. And this really could not be simpler. We simply type nixos install, hit enter, and hopefully the system builds and installs. It doesn't take that long. It takes less than 5 minutes. So we'll come back in a second once it's done its stuff. So we're finished, 3 or 4 minutes at most. It's done its stuff, and the last thing it does is it asks us to set a root password. So I'm going to do that now. And we're done. And all we need to do now is to reboot into our brand new system. So we'll see you in a second. Right, so I shut down the virtual machine. I removed the ISO so it didn't just boot from that to start off with. Rebooted the system, and you can see I'm very obviously at light DM here. However, we initially have a problem. Obviously, OTB is one of the users, but I don't have a password for OTB at the moment. So, although I wouldn't necessarily recommend this, we're going to have to just briefly log in as root. And here we are. We're at a nice, if very plain, a very, very plain desktop. And I'm immediately going to set a password for OTB. So password OTB. Great, so that's done. So I'm going to log out now, and I'm going to log in this time as OTB. And you will notice that all of a sudden, I've got full 1080 resolution, and I've got a nice, clean XFCE desktop there. There's very little here. Let's have a look. So I asked for Chromium and Firefox to be installed, so it's done that. Oh, and I've got Alacrity as well, and I will have Vim installed. So all good. Let's launch a terminal and proceed from here. So I will need to, I could use Vim, but I've started with Nano, so why not keep on with Nano? I can now go back to that configuration file. So sudo nano, and this time it's just etc nixos, and the configuration file is there. Enter my password, and here you have it. Now, I can change all sorts of different things on here, and it's really, really easy to change stuff. So let me go down to enable the desktop environment. I just installed XFCE here, but actually I could have more desktops here. So let's install, I don't know, just follow along here, desktop manager. Don't forget the capital letters, otherwise it won't boot. And I could install, I don't know, let's think, Mate. Oops. Mate.enable equals true. I could also add to this, I don't know, let's think about installing a window manager. So services .xserver .desktop manager .qtile, say, .enable equals true. So all good. Let's save that and exit it. And in order to rebuild the system now, it's really straightforward. I again have to do this as sudo, but I would just do sudo nixos rebuild and then the word switch. And it will get on and rebuild the system. Or at least it would, but Qtile seems to be causing a problem here. So we will have a look at that in a second. So let's go back into the configuration. And what I'm going to do is just, for the time being, I'm going to delete Qtile, resave it, and see if it'll rebuild now with Mate. It's looking good. And again, it doesn't actually take that long to do. Right, so it should now have installed the Mate desktop. So let's reboot and see. So here we are again at the nixos screen, the grub screen, and you can see I've got my defaults. And if I click on all configurations, you can see I've got configuration 1 and now configuration 2. The latest configuration is always the default with the little star on it. And if I just wanted to go back to the first configuration, which was XFCE desktop, I could boot that. But let's boot number 2, and I'm just going to change this to full screen while we're at it. There we go. And hopefully this should come up now and should give us the option of either booting into XFCE or booting into Mate. What I have found is that the light DM screen doesn't retain the full HD look, but hey ho, it will, or hopefully will, go to full 1920 by 1080 once I log in. And I can see that Mate is selected up at the top. So I've just had a play with this, so let's see what it brings up. And there you go. And there is a very clean looking Mate desktop. Right, let's go back into that configuration file. So let's go into sudo nano etc nixos and the configuration file, enter my password, and we're back in this. Perhaps a little bit too big there. Let me just make it slightly smaller. I think I've figured out the issue with Qtile. What we should have put down here is services.xserver dot, I believe, window manager rather than desktop manager. Qtile.enable equals true. And hopefully now this will install Qtile for us. So we'll save that. We'll come out of it. I will rebuild the system now, doing it in exactly the same way as I did before, which is simply to issue nixos-rebuild switch. And we will come back in a second. And hey, the one thing that this shows you is where you've made a spelling mistake, and I've clearly spelt, rather than services.xserver, services.xserver. So let's go back in. I found that the error messages are actually pretty good. There you are. An obvious mistake. So save it, come out of it, and let's try again. And off we go. Look, I'm going to let it build, and we'll come back in a second, and you'll see what I've put together. Okay, well, I've just rebooted, and I booted into Qtile, and I did a git clone of all of my dot files, and I can see that we have a black bar up here, but none of my widgets are coming up. So I'm assuming that there are additional packages that I need to install to get them to work. However, all of my standard packages seem to work. For some reason, PyCom doesn't seem to work. It just tells me that there's another compositor running, but all the key bindings are working anyway. And as you can see, I've managed to put some wallpaper there, and my Rofi's coming up, etc., etc. I'm sure it's just additional Python packages that are required. Basically, though, it's there, and I can launch my file manager, PCman FM, all good. I can launch Chromium, all good. And I can shut them down with no problem whatsoever. Now, I've made a few changes to the configuration file since last I was showing on video what we have here. So if I show you exactly what's been done, I've had to add a section for one of the packages that I installed, which was Joy Pixels. Apparently, Joy Pixels has a non-free license. And so when I tried to rebuild the system, it wouldn't let me do it. So I scoured through Google and the various bits and pieces, and I found that all you actually need to do, let me just show you this, is add this particular thing here. Allow packages with non-free licenses. Well, not free licenses. I don't know what I've done there, but let me just change the spelling. That's a comment anyway. And you have to put nix packages.config allow unfree equals true. Clearly, I'm going to need to play around with some fonts on this virtual machine because the fonts are horrible. I have installed the Nerd Fonts package, but I don't know, it's just not rendering as I'd want. I perhaps need to do something else. But nevertheless, it is what it is. And I've installed a load of packages here, including Joy Pixels, which this entry, nix packages.config, allow unfree equals true, allows me to do. So let's just come out. Oh, yeah, let's save that. There we go. Okay, so you can install things in two ways in NixOS. You can include them in your configuration file, and each time you rebuild, it will install whatever you've declared there, or any packages that you don't want will not appear in the iteration that you rebuild. You can also install packages on the command line, though, as well, using the nix-environment command. And the way you do this is it's sudo nix and env dash I capital A, and the way we do this, you have to type nixos dot, and I'm going to install here Thunderbird. So if you use sudo to run this nix environment, I'm just having a look there, I've spelled that wrong, nix environment, it will install for every single user. So nix environment, let's just install Thunderbird. All good. We're almost there, and it should be available in a second. So if I bring up Rofi and I go for Thunderbird, there it is. Okay, so that's great. So you can install by the command line, or you could add it to your configuration. So they call it declarative packages. I think, to be honest, if I was going to use this seriously, I would put everything in the configuration file, because I could then save that on my GitLab, and what you have is essentially a dot file where you can replicate your system anywhere. Now, it's great having these multiple iterations. It's going to start to take up a lot of space, though. And once you get your system exactly as you want it, well, you're going to want to delete previous versions to free up space. And there is a command that will allow you to do that, and it's nix collect garbage -d. And you simply run that, and it deletes all of the old profiles apart from your current one. And all you do then is you would do a rebuild. And when I go back, there will just be the one iteration, my latest iteration there. So it's an interesting system. Let's go back and have a bit of a chat. Right, okay, so that's NixOS. Let me just have a glug of my cup of tea today. Right. Overall, I'm really quite impressed with this. I haven't spent anywhere near enough time looking at it. There's obviously, I've got to figure out how to get Polkit working. It's really strange. My startup file as well, the light DM desktop files, there is no USR share X sessions folder, so I'm not quite sure how to link all that in. And I appear to be missing some packages to get all the various widgets on my bar. I'm sure there are additional Python packages, but a little bit of research will resolve it. Overall, though, I really like the idea that you can just take a config file, save it on your GitLab or save it somewhere else, and every time you do an install, you just use that configuration file and you reproduce your setup. I think that's really innovative. Will I be switching to this? No, I won't. I won't be switching to it because at the moment I'm happy with my setup, and I'm not going to start from scratch. But I will keep it on VirtualBox and continue to tweak and fiddle until I've got a setup that I really like. And we'll see what happens from there. There aren't many distros that are completely different from the norm, and this sort of satisfies that. It's unique in many ways. And so I've come away really impressed. So great distro. It's obviously still in development, so its community is growing, but the documentation is pretty good, and a really positive experience so far. So guys, that's it for today. Thanks very much for joining me. I hope you've enjoyed this video. A little bit rambly because I was exploring stuff as I went along, but that is my way. Please come and join us on Library. Come and join us on the Facebook group. And I'd like to say, obviously, a big thank you to my Patreons. And I'm just going to drag the screen over so I can read their names. So Devon, Corbinian, Robert, Gary, Aristotelis, Stormpick, Stephen, Mike, David, Entropy UK, Richard, Ty, Philip, Forrest, Scott and Patrick. Thank you guys, you're making this channel all it can be. By the way, I don't know if any of you have noticed, we've passed the 12,000 subs mark this week, so I haven't said anything, but it's quite nice to get comfortably beyond the 10,000. So with a bit of luck, 15,000 is within sight. Right, have a great weekend, everyone, and I'll see you next week.